And straight away, we have some breaking news that's coming in. U.S. President Donald Trump has once again criticized his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, in the wake of the ongoing Yellow Vest protests in France. Trump took to Twitter and said, and I quote, "The Paris Agreement isn't working out so well for Paris. Protests and riots all over France. People do not want to pay large sums of money, much to third world countries, in order to maybe protect the environment." Chanting, "We want Trump, love France." US President Trump has slammed French President Emmanuel Macron on Twitter, saying that France is chanting, "We want Trump," saying that the Paris Accord on climate change is not working out well for Paris, citing the protests and riots all over France. US President Donald Trump saying that people do not want to pay large sums of money, much to third world countries, in order to maybe protect the environment. Meanwhile, Paris is on lockdown. The French capital is witnessing the fourth weekend of anti-government protests. Paris riot police clashed near the famous Champs-Élysées Boulevard with protesters. Police fired tear gas in a bid to push back hundreds of protesters gathered around the shopping boulevard and the Arc de Triomphe monument. Police estimate that around 1,500 protesters had gathered in the area. About 8,000 police personnel have been deployed in Paris to avoid a repeat of last Saturday's mayhem. Across France, nearly 90,000 police personnel have been deployed. Police say that 211 people have been arrested after they were found with weapons such as hammers, baseball bats and metal petanque balls on them. The French police used batons as they arrested a yellow vest protester in central Paris. Hundreds of them were milling around the Arc de Triomphe monument, which was defaced with graffiti last Saturday, when rioters also torched cars and looted shops. Yellow vest protesters carried banners and gathered in central Paris against President Emmanuel Macron. More than 130 people have been injured in the protests so far. Around 31,000 yellow vests are protesting across France. As we speak, 700 in total have been detained so far. It's the worst street violence that the country has seen in decades. The French president is expected to make a statement about the protests next week. Meanwhile, landmarks like the Eiffel Tower, Arc de Triomphe, Élysée Palace, Sainte-Chapelle have been closed, along with operas, theatres, libraries and major department stores as well. Concerts and football matches have also been cancelled in view of the protests. Tourists and citizens have been instructed to remain indoors, keeping in view of the previous destruction and violence. The US, Belgium, Portugal and the Czech Republic have advised their citizens to avoid or postpone trips to Paris. Scores of high school students too have been rounded up as a precautionary measure ahead of the protests. Remember, students and farmers too have joined these protests. Protesting youth have indulged in arson and rioting in the city. In the previous rounds, these images of students kneeling with their hands behind their heads has sparked outrage on social media.
Voilà une classe qui se tient sage.
The protests come even as the government has conceded ground and withdrawn the proposed fuel tax hike. However, what began as a protest against rising fuel prices spiraled into large-scale demonstrations, with protesters demanding the easing of the budgets of hard-pressed households and an increase in the minimum wage.
Because of the much tighter police presence, the demonstration this weekend bears no resemblance to last weekend, in the sense that that was extremely violent. We saw lots of protesters throwing paving stones and other objects at the police, who responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. We've heard some reports of violence from the Champs-Élysées today, but the dramatic switch that we've seen in police tactics, where they are, as I'm saying, taking no chances at all. They're searching everyone's bags, they're searching cars, they're not hesitating to arrest people, and they have already arrested more people than ever in Paris on a single day, and significantly more people than last week. already, and that does seem to be working. It does seem to have dissuaded protesters. They have perhaps managed to catch the worst elements of the troublemakers, so we are seeing fewer yellow vests altogether out demonstrating. The Interior Ministry says there are 31,000 marching all over France, not just in Paris, compared to over 100,000 last Saturday. So the violence does seem to have scared people off. There was a deliberate effort by the Interior Minister to scare people off ahead of this. He did said numerous times on television that they were expecting a hardcore of violent demonstrators and that peaceful protesters should not turn out. And lots of people do seem to have heard that message.
Dr. David Lees, lecturer in French studies at the University of Warwick, now joins us here on World is One. Dr. Lees, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us here. I want to ask you, why has the cancellation of the fuel tax hike backfired, into a grassroots uprising?
Well, I think the situation is quite complex, really. The protests initially, as you say, were really related to the increase in fuel taxes, and now the movement has gone far beyond that and has become really a movement about some of the economic policies which Emmanuel Macron is trying to introduce in France, particularly around reducing the role of the state in public affairs, trying to reduce the size of the state and trying to increase private ownership rather of public spaces. So this is one of the major areas for which there are protests at the moment in France. But of course, people also feel that their general income and their expenditure is being increased and their income is decreasing, and therefore they feel much worse off under Emmanuel Macron. That's the major change really now. And of course, what we're seeing is a kind of general sense of discontent around Macron's leadership. This is somebody who appears to be quite aloof. He seems to be the friend of the rich rather than somebody with whom anybody can relate to. So I think this is the real change, the real shift over the last few weeks has been from this very sort of focused protest around fuel tax rises to becoming something much more sporadic and much less defined. And I think that's why we're seeing these mass demonstrations again today, particularly in Paris.
Right. Dr. Lees, if I were to ask you, what are the reasons behind President Emmanuel Macron failing to control the Yellow Vest protests that are now, crossing borders across France into other countries like Belgium as well?
Well, I think quite simply because he appears to be aloof. He doesn't seem to have any connection to ordinary people. And because of the sheer number of protesters across France, it's much more sizable than it has been previously. And I also think that police, therefore, are on the back foot quite frequently in this kind of opposition to the protests.
And in that sense, Dr. Lees, is Macron failing to balance world issues like climate change with financial challenges faced by his people at the end of every month?
Absolutely. I think Macron seems to be fundamentally focused on bigger questions, arguably more ethical questions than what's concerning ordinary people. And I think he seems to be therefore appearing to be quite removed from the concerns of ordinary people. He hasn't put forward any major reforms to social security, for example. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we're seeing these protests today, and we've seen the protests over the last few weeks.